Ciudad Valdeluz was designed for 30,000 residents. For years after construction, fewer than 2,000 lived there. The streetlights turned on every night. The plazas sat empty. Commerce arrived only after the people were supposed to already be there. This wasn't abandonment after decline. It was infrastructure first, occupancy later, and the gap between them exposed what happens when a city is built before anyone needs to move in. Spain's housing boom in the 2000s created hundreds of new developments. Most were expansions of existing towns. Valdeluz was different. It was a new town from scratch, master planned in the countryside outside Guadalajara, about 60 kilometers northeast of Madrid. The pitch was straightforward: a modern residential community near a new high-speed rail station that could reach the capital in under half an hour. Developers promised schools, parks, shopping centers, and nearly 10,000 homes. It looked like suburban growth in fast forward. The question wasn't whether Spain needed more housing. The question was whether this particular piece of countryside, with no existing population or employment base, could transform into a self-sustaining commuter suburb simply because a train station had been placed there. The foundation was the Guadalajara station on the Madrid-Barcelona high-speed line, opened in 2003. That station wasn't built in the historic center of Guadalajara. It was placed outside the city, in the rural municipality of Yebes. The location choice reflected both engineering constraints and political ambition. High-speed rail prefers gentle curves and minimal urban disruption, which often pushes stations to the periphery. But the Yebes site also represented an opportunity. Planners saw open land and rail access as the ingredients for a commuter suburb. Valdeluz was approved shortly after, projected to house around 34,000 people in roughly 9,500 units. Construction began while demand was still theoretical. The plan assumed a feedback loop. Build the infrastructure, and residents will follow. Residents will attract shops and services. Services make the town livable. Livability draws more residents. That loop requires the first wave of buyers to arrive in large enough numbers to sustain commerce and justify continued development. Valdeluz was betting on scale and speed, not organic growth. The development wasn't anchored by a university, a major employer, or an established transport hub with proven ridership. It was anchored by proximity to a new station whose passenger volumes were uncertain, and by the promise that affordable housing within rail reach of Madrid would generate its own demand. By 2006, sales were underway. Advertisements showed families moving into finished homes near parks and plazas. Early buyers were mostly young couples and families priced out of Madrid, attracted by square footage and rail access. The first phase delivered hundreds of completed units. Buyers moved in, enrolled children in the new school, and began commuting. But the national housing market was overheating. Spanish banks had extended enormous credit for construction and mortgages. Developers across the country were building ahead of demand. Confident prices would keep rising. Valdeluz was one project among many riding that wave of credit and optimism. When the global financial crisis arrived in 2008, Spain's property bubble collapsed. Credit vanished, construction halted. Projects nationwide froze mid-build. Valdeluz had completed only a fraction of its planned housing stock. Thousands of units remained unbuilt. The commercial center was incomplete. Amenities existed on paper, not on the ground. Occupancy stalled well short of the critical mass needed to make the feedback loop work. The developer had front-loaded infrastructure costs under the assumption that housing sales would fund later phases. When sales stopped, so did construction. The result was a town designed for 30,000 operating with the population of a village. Residents who had already moved in found themselves in a half-finished town. Streets were paved and lit, but many blocks sat empty. The promised shopping center had few tenants. Schools operated below capacity. Public transit to the rail station was limited because passenger volumes didn't justify frequent service. The rail link to Madrid existed, but it didn't function as a true commuter line without density at both ends. High-speed rail tickets were more expensive than conventional trains, and the station's location outside Guadalajara's center meant residents needed a car or infrequent bus to reach it. People who bought based on the full vision were living in the incomplete version, surrounded by the physical shell of a city that hadn't filled in. The story became shorthand for Spain's overbuilding crisis. International media labeled Valdeluz a ghost town. That label stuck, even though residents rejected it. The town wasn't abandoned, it was severely underoccupied. Families lived there, children attended school, but the place felt hollow because so much of the planned fabric never materialized. Low occupancy weakened the commercial viability of retail and services, which in turn made settlement less attractive, reinforcing the gap between plan and reality. A supermarket needs a certain number of customers to stay open. A bus route needs enough riders to run frequently. Valdeluz had neither, so early residents faced longer trips for daily needs and fewer reasons to stay. What went wrong wasn't construction quality or location, it was timing and sequence. Valdeluz front-loaded infrastructure and housing supply without securing demand or employment anchors first. The high-speed rail station enabled the project, but it didn't create the economic activity needed to sustain a new town. Rail access is an amenity, not an economy. A commuter suburb works when people have jobs to commute to and when enough people make that commute to support local commerce. Valdeluz assumed residential demand alone would fill in the gaps. When the credit and housing markets collapsed, that assumption unraveled. The mechanics of new town development require either a phased build-out that matches occupancy or an anchor institution that guarantees baseline activity. Valdeluz attempted neither. There's a planning principle that distinguishes infrastructure-led development from demand-led growth. Infrastructure-led means building roads, utilities, and housing ahead of residents, expecting the investment to attract them. Demand-led means responding to existing pressure with incremental expansion. Infrastructure-led can succeed when backed by strong market fundamentals, patient capital, and realistic timelines. It fails when developers overestimate demand, underestimate absorption rates, or rely on perpetually rising prices to finance later phases. Valdeluz combined infrastructure-led ambition with speculative financing in a market that turned out to be a bubble. The crash didn't create the problem. It revealed the fragility of a model that required everything to go right. In the years after the crash, occupation slowly increased. By the mid-2010s, population had grown as distressed units sold at lower prices and Spain's economy stabilized. Valdeluz today is no longer the extreme case it was in 2010, but it remains smaller and less complete than originally planned. The infrastructure built for 30,000 supports a community of several thousand, meaning per capita costs are higher and service provision remains constrained by lower density. The town functions, but not at the scale or efficiency its designers intended. Some planned phases were never built, the commercial center never filled, the vision of a thriving suburb never fully materialized, though the settlement is no longer the hollow shell it once was. The lesson isn't that new towns always fail. Successful examples exist worldwide, from Milton Keynes in the UK to new towns in the Netherlands and Singapore. What distinguishes success from failure is usually the presence of economic anchors, phased construction that matches absorption, public investment in transport and services, and realistic demand forecasting. Valdeluz had rail access and master planning, but it lacked employment, it front-loaded construction, and it relied on speculative buyer enthusiasm during a bubble. When those conditions reversed, the town was left incomplete. The workable alternative isn't to never build new towns, it's to sequence development so that infrastructure, housing, employment, and services arrive in a coordinated rhythm rather than all at once in anticipation of a population that hasn't moved yet. It means anchoring new development with institutions or employers that provide baseline demand independent of housing sales. It means phasing construction so that each stage reaches occupancy and commercial viability before the next begins. And it means financing models that don't require perpetual growth to avoid collapse. Valdeluz was built on the assumption that infrastructure alone would pull people in fast enough to make the rest viable. When the market turned, that assumption left early residents stranded in a place designed for a future that didn't arrive on schedule. Visual reconstructions are illustrative. Facts and interpretations are based on the sources listed in the description.